Okay, in this last video for chapter 4, I wanted to go over a few things, conditions that affect our overall GI tract as it's related to nutrition, and one of the things that affects the GI tract seemingly the most is inflammation, and it's relatively common to have some type of inflammatory problem in the GI tract. We'll see some specific examples as we go through, and so there's just kind of a book definition for inflammation. It's when our immune system has some kind of response, usually to some type of infectious agent, right? So, maybe a virus, or, a bacteria. Um, and so if just about everybody's had a stomach virus before. And so that's you kind of know those GI tract symptoms such as vomiting or diarrhea, generally, and so that's kind of our system's response to try to get rid of that infection. It doesn't always have to be an infectious agent. Sometimes it's an allergy or allergen that our body is responding to. Sometimes our body is producing, antibodies that actually infect our cells. In other words, we have an almost like an autoimmune problem with some of these disorders that we'll look at. And so here's kind of some of the classic symptoms, maybe not all directly related to the GI tract, but the classic symptoms for inflammation include pain, heat. In other words, you have warmness to the touch, and that's generally because you have extra blood flow to an area. And so you can feel that through the skin sometimes. Tissue redness, there again, you've got extra blood flow, swelling, loss of function. And that kind of depends on how severe the inflammatory response is. If you're talking about a like a movable joint that it's painful to walk on, or it's painful to move a joint, then you may have loss of function of say like your knee joint or something. And then fever is a very common symptom for a systemic or system-wide inflammatory response. And so we'll kind of look at some of the a few different diseases or problems associated with the GI tract, and many times these are related to our overall nutrition. And so, in general, kind of a broad grouping is known as inflammatory bowel diseases. These are chronic or long-term type problems that that cause inflammatory problems, inflammatory response, or in other words, swelling, pain, usually located somewhere in the intestines, small and large intestines, and or inflammation because of that will disrupt processes taking place in the intestines, including digestion. Remember, your small intestines are doing a lot of digestion. That's because small intestines are getting enzymes from the pancreas to kind of finish up the digestion. Um, Nutrient absorption that's taking place both in the small intestines and somewhat in the large intestines. Large intestines mainly absorbing things like excess water and electrolytes, and can even cause some damaging effects in the intestinal tract. So let's look at some examples here of inflammatory bowel diseases. Two most common that you'll see are UC, ulcerative colitis. As the name implies, you can see a couple things. Ulcer in the first part here. So this is the formation of ulcers in the large intestine. That's what colitis is referring to. Colon is another name for the large intestine, and the ending here, itis, is referring to inflammation. And so ulcerative colitis is inflammation taking place in a portion of the large intestine that could lead to ulcers. And so, as you can imagine, having ulcers in the lower gut area can lead to some painful abdominal cramping, potentially, depending on the severity of it, could lead to bleeding through the rectum, could lead to diarrhea because of these factors like the cramps, the pain that's there, the diarrhea. It could lead to weight loss if you're not, you're not having a healthy appetite, you're not able to eat because you're having abdominal cramps. You're not, you're losing weight because of the diarrhea. You may become anemic because you're not eating the proper nutrition, or things are not getting absorbed correctly. Because remember, if you're eating the proper nutrition, uh, but you're not able to absorb it into into the bloodstream, then you could still be having problems with anemia. And of course, that's characterized by not getting enough iron, and that's generally causing us to feel very fatigued. That kind of goes back to, you need that iron for the hemoglobin inside of the red blood cells to work correctly. The hemoglobin is going to help to transport oxygen. If you're not transporting oxygen correctly throughout the body, the organs, you have a fatigue feeling, could have high heart rate as the body tries to compensate for that. So ulcerative colitis, um, I'm not really sure that they have a known cause for this. Sometimes I think some of the research is pointing to like autoimmunity. So our body's producing, for whatever reason, antibodies that are kind of causing some inflammatory reactions inside of the in the intestines. Crohn's disease, you do hear about this occasionally. You can do some more research on this if you like. One difference here, this is still inflammatory. One difference here is that generally you can see this, you can find this taking place, the inflammation taking place just about through the entire GI tract. Remember, the GI tract begins in the mouth. Gastrointestinal tract begins in the mouth. It goes through the esophagus, down to the stomach, out from the stomach to the small intestine, large intestines, through the rectum, anus. And so you've got the entirety of the GI tract that could potentially be affected by some of the problems with Crohn's disease. And so I listed some of the main symptoms again. They overlap with the other inflammatory bowel diseases: diarrhea, cramping, loss of appetite, and potentially weight loss because of course, the diarrhea and loss of appetite there. Some other just general things that you see very commonly in the GI tract for various reasons: constipation. And so, that could be just dietary related. It could just be you don't have enough fiber in your diet. Fiber, and we'll talk about this in chapter 5, a complex carbohydrate that we need, a polysaccharide that we need from plants. If we're not eating a lot of plants or some healthy plant fibrous, fruits and vegetables, we may be in legumes, beans, we're not getting enough fiber in our diet. That could definitely cause some constipation. And some individuals may need to take a fiber type of supplement, and you can Google and find all kinds of different fiber supplements in pill form or powder form or even gummy form now. And so, if you're having problems with constipation, that may be something to look at, see what our diet looks like as far as fiber goes. It can also be just being dehydrated, not getting enough water in the diet. We've got another chapter talking about water, but we need the proper hydration to do a lot of things in our body. All the cell chemical reactions taking place in the body require our cells to be properly hydrated. And there's different estimates about how much water individuals need to take in. Some of the fruits and vegetables, of course, will count for our water intake, but if we're not getting enough water, and it depends on the person, the build of the person, how active the person is, as far as how much water that you need. But if you're not drinking water throughout the day, you're getting some, clear liquids throughout the day, and you're having constipation, then that's definitely a sign that you may be dehydrated, and you need to make sure you're getting plenty of water. There could be other issues, other underlying effects, such as anxiety or depression, that can cause constipation, or may lead to poor nutrition, poor diet, or not enough water. Changes in our daily routine, that kind of goes back again to the first two, because if we're not eating meals at proper times, or we're on the go and too fast, and we're not getting a good diet, and we're forgetting to drink water, that could definitely cause some constipation side effects there. And ignoring the need to defecate. Sometimes you see this in individuals, especially kids that perhaps are not comfortable using the restroom in public places or at school, and so they're trying to kind of hold everything in, and so that can lead to problems and constipation that way as well. Diarrhea, kind of the opposite effect here. Usually we think of diarrhea as more infectious related. And so it could be a bacterial infection, could be viral infection, things like these, what we call the stomach virus or stomach flu, as sometimes you hear that said that way. And that can cause some inflammation to occur, and that can lead to diarrhea. A problem here is, again, dehydration, because you are losing fluids. Usually it's not a problem where, if you've got a 24-hour virus, as they call it, a stomach virus, in 24 hours, you're 28, 48 hours, you're good to go. You definitely need to replace those fluids. You definitely need to replace those electrolytes, sodium and potassium. But it's usually not a problem. If you have a more serious or long-term infection, some of you may have heard of C. diff. This is a bacterial infection from the Clostridium bacteria, and it has some really nasty side effects. And it's, we're talking about lots of diarrhea. We're talking about, long-term problems, very difficult to treat and get rid of. And so you may have more serious effects there for sure. Vomiting, usually, again, it's not a problem. If you're talking about, you've got the stomach virus for a day or day and a half or something, again, you got to watch out for dehydration as one of the main problems there. But, it could be maybe you've had, some kind of food poisoning. It says ingestion of toxic substances, but that could be food related. It could be that, you've had some kind of food poisoning. Some, and we'll look at this in a later chapter, but some bacteria, again, go back to the Clostridium group. That group produces toxins. And so, if you've heard of botulism or food poisoning, it could be that the bacteria has produced some toxins that have contaminated the food, and that causes us to vomit. And so it definitely could cause some problems there with our electrolytes and dehydration. Intense pain, head injuries, motion sickness, migraines, these are all very severe potential causes for vomiting. And they just kind of give you some tips here to, you want to take in more fluids, make sure you're getting more fluids. You want to avoid, a heavy meal, of course, until your vomiting resolves. Start with something, easy, maybe some soup of some sort or broth that replaces the fluid and the electrolytes. The carbonation, you want to avoid that, because that could make us more kind of uneasy in our gut or on our stomach there. Reflux, acid reflux is really what this is talking about. We'll kind of look at the names there: gastroesophageal reflux disease, GERD, but it's talking about acid reflux or heartburn. Sometimes you hear it called that. Gastro is referring to the stomach. Esophageal is the esophagus. And you can kind of imagine that stomach acid. Remember, the stomach is producing hydrochloric acid to help in digestion, breakdown of proteins mainly. But if that acid begins to enter and come back or reflux into the tube here, the esophagus, obviously that's going to cause some irritation, some pain, some burning sensation. And so it could potentially lead to damaging the lining of the esophagus. Your esophagus does have a lining there. It does have some mucous membrane there, but it's not used to having a stomach acid inside the esophagus. And so, it could potentially cause some problems there. It could potentially, if it's not treated or if it continues to happen, may cause ulcers in the esophagus. Some studies have shown that long-term problems with acid reflux could potentially lead to certain types of cancers of the esophagus. And that leads us to ulcers, peptic ulcers. This is referring to ulcers in the stomach. Remember, you have an enzyme here called pepsin, so that's kind of where this name is coming from here. And so these are ulcers or gastric ulcers that you find in the stomach lining or the duodenum, the first section there of the small intestine. That first section of the small intestine is receiving the acidic chyme from the stomach, and so it's receiving some acid mixed up, with our food from the stomach. It's trying to neutralize it, but that first section there of the small intestine can be very acidic, and so that's why you could potentially have peptic ulcers in the small intestine, or at least that section. You can imagine if you've got ulcers forming in these places, you're going to have some pain, a lot of pain there, especially after eating. Sometimes this could be infectious related, and so there's a particular bacteria known as Helicobacter pylori, and that kind of offsets our normal, bacteria that's in the body, and that stomach infection can cause a problem with the lining of the stomach, and you naturally have a mucous membrane inside of the stomach lining that tries to help neutralize or protect the lining of the stomach from the stomach acid, and that Helicobacter kind of interferes with that mucous membrane. Other problems seemingly associated with stomach ulcers could be smoking or alcohol consumption, or NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, things like aspirin or ibuprofen that we take on a normal basis. Usually this is kind of like a long-term scenario. If you're taking, and I don't know necessarily what dosage it would be, but if you're taking some type of aspirin or ibuprofen for long-term, and you may have, and you may have maybe other acidic foods in the body or in the stomach, it could potentially lead to some problems with ulcers. And this picture here is trying to show you, this is the inner lining of the stomach. You naturally have folds on the inside of the stomach, but you can kind of see these very large, prominent ulcers that have formed here. Redness, pain, inflammation is taking place, because of these ulcers. Irritable bowel syndrome, another potential problem with the GI tract, especially the lower GI tract. As the name implies, it's a syndrome, so it has several, kind of symptoms that are associated with this particular disease or syndrome. Intestinal cramping, for sure. Could have abdominal bowel movements such as diarrhea or constipation. It depends on what the trigger is or what's kind of causing this. Generally, there's no real direct cause per se, but some foods generally seem to trigger this. It could be there again. It could be related to some autoimmune issues. It could be stress that may lead to irritable bowel syndrome. And so one common thing to do is kind of look at our diet to find out what types of foods are we eating. We may need to look at how many of these, what are called FODMAP foods that we have, or diet. And so treatment is usually based on trying to limit or decrease FODMAPs. FODMAPs is an acronym that stands for fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, polyols. These are all sugar groups, carbohydrates. Oligosaccharides, oligo means few, and so these have a few sugar units kind of bonded together. Disaccharides, these are two sugar units chemically bonded. Would be like sucrose. We got another chapter that deals with carbohydrates shortly. Monosaccharides, mono means one, and so this is something like a simple sugar like glucose or fructose. Polyol, this is what's known as a sugar alcohol, such as you may have heard of sorbitol or mannitol. These can be a problem and can lead to IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, and some of these symptoms, because some of these cause, if you have too much of these in your diet, some of these will cause extra water to kind of flood into. They kind of attract water to flow into the intestines. In other words, that could cause diarrhea. Some of these don't get fully digested in the intestines, in the small intestines, and so if they're not digested, they kind of move on into the large intestines, where Bacteria kind of see these as food sources, and so they'll start digesting them. What that means is the byproduct of kind of feeding all these bacteria in the large intestines with these FODMAP groups is that these carbohydrates is that the bacteria will produce extra gas as a waste product, and that can create pain, and it can lead to constipation. It can cause problems in our GI tract, cramping and things. And so generally they say we'll kind of try to adjust our diets not to have as much sugar and some of these carbohydrates. And so and of course, if we have a lot of emotional stress going on, we may need to find ways to work with that stress. Maybe some counseling would be helpful, perhaps even antidepressants, something to try to relieve some of that underlying stress, and that may help our overall GI tract. It may be also a place to look at, do we need a probiotic? Are we getting enough fiber? Are we getting prebiotics to try to help with our kind of the healthy bacteria that we have in our bodies? Last couple things we look at. One of the more serious, all of these have some serious implications, but one of the more serious here, I guess, is cancers that are associated with the colon or the rectum, colorectal cancer. According to some later statistics, this is the second leading cause of cancer deaths among adults in the U.S. So that's very significant. And Table 4 has some of the major signs and symptoms, such as change in a usual bowel movement, sensation the bowel movements are incomplete, bloody bowel movements, and or dark stools, indicating that there's some type of perhaps an ulcer that's causing some bleeding there, kind of long-term abdominal cramps or cramping, fatigue or tiredness, weight loss, and anemia. And the last little graphic here, I just want to kind of show you, is just kind of pinpointing where different issues or disorders of the intestines could take place along, the majority here of the GI tract. And so you can see there with the esophagus, you would have acid reflux there in the esophagus going into the stomach. You could potentially have peptic ulcers in the stomach area, and kind of going into that first section of the small intestines. You generally find ulcerative colitis in the colon here. The large intestine is there. Very common to find Crohn's disease, even though Crohn's disease affects many parts of the GI tract. A lot of times it's in the colon also. And so you can kind of see some of these mapped out on the GI tract area. So that kind of concludes chapter 4. I know that's a fairly long chapter, 3 videos for chapter 4, and but hopefully that kind of summarizes a lot of the information there for chapter 4 on body basics. Thanks, guys.